Okay, Carol, you can go ahead and start the session.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our last day at the colloquium. My name is Carolina. I'll be moderating this morning. Just a quick note on the structure of the session. Each speaker will have 20 minutes for their presentation. We will first hear 3 presentations in sequence, followed by a discussion session. Then we will have 2 final presentations, followed by a second discussion. Without further ado, let us begin. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Datesh Parulekar from SEAS, SEAS. Thank you for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible to everyone? Yeah, thank you. Just a sec. Okay. So I'm going to speak to you about. Do you hear an echo? Or only am I hearing an echo? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to speak to you about India's AI vision. And there are 2 important facets to it. One is technology with trust, and the other is in terms of understanding how talent meets opportunity. Last month, India hosted the AI Summit. 89 countries, including India, passed the resolution. And India's slogan, or India's motto, was what we call in Sanskrit, Sarvajan Sukhai, Sarvajan Hitai. Now, let me explain what this means. Sarvajan means all. So, Sukhai means happiness, and Hitai means welfare. So, basically, our model of ethical AI is happiness of all and welfare for all. And that is how the digital ecosystem in India is being built up. Now, whenever we look at AI, there is always this balance you have to find between innovation and equity and inclusiveness. Because innovation means you have to allow pioneers to run riot in terms of their imagination. But if there has to be welfare for society, then there has to be equity, there has to be inclusiveness, there has to be transparency, there has to be fairness, and there has to be accountability. Now, why is India so unique in this AI debate? India is in many ways a laboratory for responsible AI, for equitable AI, and for a democratic AI. Not only is it a country of 1.4 billion people, but its young demography makes it a laboratory for innovations when it comes to AI. In terms of patents filing, India is the 6th biggest in the world. So in terms of intellectual property filing, and in terms of skilling, which is so very important in AI system, India is only 2nd to China in terms of AI skill. But while these are the quantitative metrics, the qualitativeness of the AI argument is important. When India launched its digital ecosystem 10 years ago, there were the 3 A's that India talked about. India's digital ecosystem, now extended to AI, talks about affordability, accessibility, and adaptation. Now, this goes to the heart of an ethical AI system, because affordability essentially means that you have to ensure that the creator and the consumer are having a level playing field. And India has been known for low-cost innovations across a broad spectrum of digital areas. And so developing a standard or an ethical code for this becomes extremely important. India has also been known for accessibility. Its DPI, in fact, talks about accessibility. And accessibility here means two things. One, accessibility between the technology creator and the technology consumer, but also access in terms of the urban centers and the rural centers. And this is important because ethical, AI has to take into account the geographical imbalances that we have, which technology must address and not accentuate. But there is an adaptive nature to AI that is also unique to India's ethical argument, which means ultimately the end game of all AI has to be the end user accountability, the end user utility. So it's not about the creator of the AI product, it is about the user and how that user essentially feels. When India puts out its digital public infrastructure, it has come up with an ethical code that encapsulates 5 dimensions. The first dimension is full spectrum dialogue with target sectors. So if you are basically launching AI, not just in India, but abroad, you will engage with all the stakeholders to whom that AI applies, the widest possible consultation. The second is it has to be fiscally prudent because AI should not break the back of economic systems. Otherwise, it takes away from the very ethicality of this particular product. The third is in terms of ensuring that it's environmentally conscious and does not put a huge load on countries, doesn't make countries choose between environmental consciousness and making the push for AI. The fourth is the AI model is locally driven. So it's based on grassroots demand and not top down in terms of what the state tells you. And the fifth is it is non-exclusionary and non-antagonistic, which means that if India is pushing an AI model, it does not exclude any other competitor from also pitching its own AI model. And I can give you a classic example of how this is finding strategic traction in the global south, because in 2016, long before AI became a reality, but when digital public infrastructure was, India hosted the India-Africa Forum Summit, where the Prime Minister Modi asked African leaders what they believe India can do for them. And in unison, all the African leaders came forward and said, we would like India to set up the continent-wide hotline and lay the optical fiber cable for that. Now, clearly, there are other players, competitors to India who can do this as well. Why did African countries feel it was necessary for India to lay something which is something confidential, sensitive, and clearly privileged? So clearly, there is here a belief, a commitment that India's AI model or India's EPI model, technological model, is technology driven by trust, technology driven by integrity. In terms of the ethical understanding, India has come up with 5 dimensions to how they want to build a robust ethical code. The first is, and there's the term is called Manav, M-A-N-A-V. Now, Manav in Hindi, it means human being. And India's unique model has been that we are for human-centric development. So the objective of all AI development has to be the human-centric benefaction and not necessarily either benefiting corporates or state-owned corporations. And the reason for that being, India presents itself as in many ways a middle ground between the US Western model, which is built on corporate profits and lends a secondary status to ethics, and maybe the Chinese model, which is again very stellar in terms of its transformation, but is driven essentially by a state-guided capitalism. So India believes that their model can actually address the large part of the global south whose conditions are very similar to what India has. So the 5 elements, so M stands for moral and ethical systems. And here the important part is a democratic AI, a human AI, and an AI which is based on ethical standards. So India has already begun working on a national ethical standard system, which is based on time-tested civilizational principles of dharma and nyaya. Now, dharma is a word that is quite often misunderstood in the West. Many in the world take the literally meaning as in religion. But dharma in Sanskrit and dharma in Indian civilization means righteousness and not religion. Now, righteousness in something as pioneering as technology calls in the element of responsibility on the part of the person developing the AI product, calls into question the sagacity and the sapience and the judiciousness of this person, but also calls into question the regulatory ecosystem that states built. So there is a righteousness on the part of the creator, there's a righteousness on the part of the regulator, and there's a righteousness on the part of the user as well. Accountable governance. I mean, this is again a very important thing because most global South countries are fighting legal systems that are not robust enough. And while you need to build a strong legal system, it's also important to work with the global norm because ultimately legal standards cannot be juxtaposed. If legal standards are juxtaposed, we will have the same problem that we are probably looking at in the future now, where you have two internets, a US-led internet and a Chinese-led internet. So you can't really have systems and laws that are built against each other. So you have to come up with a global South common position on legal standards, which then has to negotiate with the global North to find common ground. National sovereignty is a very important thing because whether it's India, whether it's Brazil, whether it's African countries, or many countries of the global South, it's all about the data and the data sets. And particularly in a country like India, where we are a very complex country of 1.4 billion people, we have almost 1,600 languages and dialects, and probably 15 or 20 different identities in terms of ethnic terms. So at this time, if you are relying on uniformity in data sets that come up, then they will lead to conformity biases, and that again undermines the ethicality, the sustainability of AI systems. And so national sovereignty here means data control, data mining, data protection, and creating sound systems that don't allow the data either to be misused or data to be misinterpreted so that it hurts many sections of society. Accessible and inclusive AI is important because again, in a country like India and many countries of the global South, the stakeholders are not uniform. The stakeholders, vary from people who live in the urban centers to women, to marginalized societies, to labor, and there are many other sectoral stakeholders that exist. So an inclusive and accessible AI is one that does not create fetters or filters on the way in which AI is distributed, but actually makes AI available for anybody and everybody so that there is genuine empowerment and upliftment. In fact, India has come up with a AI, what we call as an AI Shram Setu, which is basically a description of how AI is being linked to startups in rural countrysides. Now, this power, when embodied in the minds of young people, regardless of where they hail from in a country, allows you to build a bottom-up democratic AI ecosystem that is both ethical, that is both enduring and sustainable. And last but not the least is the need for validated and legitimate systems. And this is important because regulation becomes a very important aspect to ensure that ethicality at all times is kept uppermost while designing and developing institutional systems. Now, the thing about India, and this is my final point in conclusion, when you look at India's leadership, India is offering a lot of leadership at the AI systems level at a global level. In 2023, India co-chaired the global summit on AI, which led to a global partnership on AI. In fact, last year, India co-chaired the AI summit that was hosted by President Macron in Paris. And this time, India hosted the AI, which had the largest signatory base in terms of resolution being approved. So what you're seeing is India is coming forward and trying to build a values-based AI system, which is founded on public literacy and an informed citizenry. It is based on building the moral integrity and character of society. So this year, last month, when we held the AI summit, a massive national pledge was taken across the country where people committed themselves to developing morally sound and ethically solid, artificial intelligence systems. And the most important aspect here is that we have to break divides of every kind, whether it's the technological divide, whether it's the developmental divide in terms of urban and rural centers, whether it's the divide between the global north and the global south, or whether it is the divide simply between academia, between government, between technology, between entrepreneurs, and between the end consumer. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think I rest my case here.
Thank you, Datesh. Now I would like to invite our second speaker, Mikhail Korkov. He will present AI and Europe Plans, Illusions, Reality. The floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone in Brazil. But first of all, let me please upload my presentation, PowerPoint. Well, okay. Full screen. Okay. Well, the topic is AI on Europe. In June 2024, the European Union adopted the world's first rules on AI, the Artificial Intelligence Act. It will be fully applicable 24 months after entry into force, that is in June 2026. But some parts will be applicable sooner. A more detailed implementation plan looks like this. The ban of AI systems posing an acceptable risk started to apply on 2nd February 2025. Codes of practice will apply 9 months after entry into force. Rules of general purpose AI systems that need to comply with transparency requirements will apply 12 months after the entry into force. High-risk AI systems will have more time to comply with the requirements of the obligations concerning them will become applicable 36 months, that means 3 years, after their entry into force. High-risk AI systems should, however, be distinguished from AI systems involving unacceptable risk, which are completely banned. Banned AI systems and applications involving unacceptable risk in the EU include cognitive behavior manipulation of people or specific vulnerable groups, for example, voice-activated cloning,
seems to be some background noise. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you. Social scoring, AI, classifying people based on behavioral, socioeconomic status or personal characteristics, biometric identification and categorization of people, real-time and remote biometric identification systems, such as facial recognition in public spaces. However, there are important exceptions to this rule. Some exceptions may be allowed for law enforcement purposes. Real-time remote biometric identification systems will be allowed in a limited number of serious cases, while post-remote biometric identification systems, where identification occurs after significant delay, will be allowed to prosecute serious crimes and only after court approval. High risk AI systems that negatively affect safety of fundamental rights will be considered high risk and will be divided into two categories. First, AI systems that are used in products falling under include toys, aviation, cars, medical devices, and lifts. Second, AI system falling into specific areas that will have to be registered in the EU database, namely management and operation of critical infrastructure, education, vocational training, employment, worker management, and access to self-employment, access to and enjoyment of essential private services and public services and benefits, law enforcement, migration, asylum, and border control management, assistance in legal interpretation and application of the law. All high-risk AI systems will be assessed before being put into the market and also throughout their life cycle. People will have the right to file complaints about AI systems to designated national authorities. The EU AI Act will therefore come into force in its entirety very shortly, thereby becoming a regulatory framework for all EU member states. Its strategic aim is to transform Europe into an AI continent. To this effect, the European Commission has outlined a corresponding action plan. My aim in this brief presentation is not to give a concise overview of this plan, but above all to examine it through the eyes of a philosopher and historian. In this sense, I would like allow myself to view this document from a distancing perspective. First, as a historian, I would like to view this document as though it had already become history even before it came into force. Second, as a philosopher, I would prefer to maintain a certain distance in relation to this document, which would allow me to avoid taking an explicit pro or contra position. Because such a position, due to the lack of critical distance, would inevitably be associated with this or that ideology, none of which I, as a philosopher, consider necessary to share without careful consideration and discussion. So, what is the action plan for turning Europe into an AI continent? The first point involves the accumulation of large databases and their processing using artificial intelligence based on an infrastructure or ecosystem of supercomputers, much of which has yet to be created, most precisely to build large-scale AI data and computing infrastructures across Europe for the AI ecosystem. The more detailed plan is to make so-called artificial intelligence factories, or even AI gigafactories, the key element of this AI ecosystem. That's how this looks like. How do these AI factories operate? AI factories function by standardizing the production of AI data, similar to a physical factory producing goods. This process is divided into data ingestion, model training and refinement, inference selling, data flywheel. These facilities differ from traditional data centers by being specialized for high-density computer, liquid cooling, and AI-specific networking. To give more detail, the plan to develop AI factories in the EU can be divided into what is already working and what will needs to be built and introduced into operation. That is what already works. There's a lot of supercomputers in many countries are already working. And that must be the future. First of all, so-called gigafactories. Altogether, it looks like this. Again. I would allow myself to make a few essential critical remarks on this point. First and foremost, artificial intelligence factories and supercomputers, let aside the gigafactories, require an enormous amount of electricity to power their processors and blocks, and even more to cool them. The European Union simply does not have this amount of electricity at its disposal at the moment. It's also unclear where it might come from in the near future. Electricity is crucial for the AI. There is no AI without electricity. The AI just doesn't work without electricity. Only natural intelligence doesn't need electricity for its functioning. I think it's crucial difference. So no electricity, no AI. The only outcome of the current energy shortages, which are driving unprecedented rises in the prices of electricity, natural gas, and petrol, in reevaluation of previous energy policy strategies, it primarily concerns expanding the scope of nuclear energy, building new nuclear power stations, and even discussing the possibility of using thermonuclear energy in the future, although this is still a long way from practical implementation. Increasing the use of brown and black coal for energy purposes, and the potential use of fracking technology for gas extraction in Central Europe. In this case, it's worth noting the shift in public opinion in those countries where such practices have either been completely stopped and banned, for example in Germany, or have been repeatedly condemned by activists of the European countries or the European Union leadership, for example in Poland. Secondly, all these AI factories can only produce a synergetic effect when they interact with one another. In other words, only if they are integrated into a collaborative network. However, this is impossible today for technological reasons, due to the lack of materials with the high conductivity required for the fast and efficient co-working of AI systems. Higher conductivity is only possible within supercomputers, but not between them. The technical challenge of creating such high conductivity materials has not yet been solved, even in theory. In practice, it could take decades, if it's possible at all, simply because the technologies involved in this field demand the impossible from the laws of physics as we know them today. Consequently, each of the existing and current operating European supercomputers is forced to work in isolation from the others as a sovereign supercomputer, unless, of course, one takes into account the possibility of local and as yet rather insignificant data exchange between them via traditional data carriers. The situation is further complicated by the way decisions are made within the EU, because there are many states and every state has its own laws and its own bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the second strategic priority for AI development in the EU involves unlocking access to high-quality data for AI innovators by establishing, on the technological basis of supercomputers, the so-called European Data Union and creating the necessary infrastructure for collecting and accumulating big data. So that is the action plan. The aim is to make big data as accessible as possible to both public sector and private businesses at both national and European level. At the same time, the intention is to simplify data flow processes as much as possible. So that is how it looks like. However, the question remains as to extent of which this will be technologically feasible and whether legal frameworks and bureaucratic barriers in each EU country could hinder its implementation. Of particular concern is the fact that a significant part of this data integrated into digital infrastructures will consist of sensitive personal data of a biometric and biomedical nature data that will be classified as high risk and therefore subject to special regulation and control in accordance with the classification set out at the beginning of my talk. And how, in such a case, should the issue of their openness and accessibility to all in the EU be resolved in practice? This is still a huge problem, both at the theoretical and practical levels. So that is the sector marked in red. From this perspective, it's highly likely that what is being discussed here is in fact a plan to build a future pan-European healthcare system, which, given the current, I would say, collapse of the insurance-based healthcare system in most EU countries, seems somewhat utopian. The question of who will pay for all this and how much is not only on the agenda, but is becoming increasingly pressing with each new day. And that is without even considering the numerous ethical issues that inevitably arise in connection with each of the points listed in the EU Action Agenda. If we take all these factors into account, we cannot rule out the possibility that this new form of healthcare will simply not be accessible to everyone, or rather it will not be equally accessible to everyone. It would be very interesting to examine the social, political, economic, cultural, and ethical implication of this trend in detail. However, this goes beyond the scope of my current talk, which I am now concluding. Thank you very much for your attention. Muito obrigado pela atenção.
Muito obrigada. Thank you very much, Mikhail Kurkov. We now move to our third speaker, Roger Crisp, from the University of Oxford. His presentation is titled AI Governance and Ethical Decision Making. Please go ahead.
Ooh.
Roger Crisp.
Apparently, he's no longer in the room.
Yes.
Let's see what happened. If he sends us any message or let us know what's going on. At any rate, Carolina, just to make sure we're going to use this time to proceed with the discussion. You may open the floor for the discussion.
Okay. So let's now open the floor for discussion. I invite the audience to share questions. You may write in the chat or raise your hand while we wait for Roger Crisp.
Okay, I'll start myself since both Datesh and Mikhail are our good friends and colleagues from BRICS bloc, respectively from India and Russian Federation. And in both presentations, we saw the whole thing of AI infrastructure in Europe. I'd like to ask you guys about this whole challenge of AI infrastructure in both India and Russia, because as far as we can tell from what we get here in Brazil, both India and Russia have very well-developed AI infrastructures in terms of both technology and resource. And we were just wondering, for instance, in Datesh's presentation, he mentioned the thing of having different platforms. And so my question for both of you guys is about the way, is there any kind of a state intervention? And if there is, what kind of difficulties you'd find in terms of, being free to launching a new platform, allowing for platforms to run in India and Russia, etc. Please feel free to say wherever you find appropriate for this conference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I think that's a very important question. I would say one of the most important, impediments or, if I may say, hurdles that the government of India faces is how to build the AI ecosystem by managing the complexity and the diversity of Indian society. In fact, one of the big problems has been that we are a country, as I said, of 1.4 billion people. We speak hundreds and thousands of languages. We have very different dialects. And in many cases, what you are speaking in one language gets so easily lost in translation or misinterpreted, and that can then lead to many algorithmic excesses, if I may call that. So the government has taken a position. In fact, we have one AI platform called Bhashini. Bhasha means language. So what it does is, in 22 of India's national languages, the inter-language translation is being conducted through this autonomously built AI platform. Because otherwise, if you're drawing on data sets, if you're drawing on responses from the global north, then they will not fit the strategic context of what India is trying to do. So managing the complexity and the diversity and ensuring that everybody is together in terms of driving AI becomes the biggest impediment. The second, about the whole issue of state intervention that you talked about. So I had talked in my lecture about how Indian intervention is in many ways between the Chinese model and the Western model. The Western model being largely driven by corporates and with very little play of the state, and the Chinese model where the state effectively guides, all the innovation and all the development that's happening. In the Indian context, India is focusing more on regulation, but not excessive regulation, not the EU kind of regulation. In fact, one of the ways in which we are doing things differently from the European Union is that the European Union basically puts, shutters any kind of innovation if it goes against, established regulations. India, on the other hand, is not shuttering any kind of innovation. It's providing maximum scope for human innovation. It, in fact, if it contravenes any of the laws, it tries to run pilot programs. Rather than shut down the entire innovation together, you run pilot programs to see where this is leading. And then if it is contravening the law or if it's going against the regulations in place, then you take a call later. So India's focus is on calibrating its regular AI development, but also responsible AI deployment. So I would basically put it in that context. Yeah.
If we compare different models of AI creating and regulating, then we will see that a Russian model is not close to the European model. That means AI is not only controlled, but also created with great support of the state, of the governments, and of this system of EU central organs. Russian model is very close, I would say, to the US-American model. That means EU is responsibility of private companies, great, that dominates the market, and also middle and small one. Surely it's all controlled by the state and used by the state. But if we take into account my presentation about supercomputers in Europe, they're all built and financed by the state. So it's a project of the countries. In Russia, the most powerful supercomputers built and regulated by the private companies. So, for example, by the Russian analog of Google, surprisingly developed by the same people that's Yandex, the most powerful supercomputer. The computer of the University of Moscow is only fourth in the country. So, from the other point of view, all these supercomputers, first of all, Yandex supercomputer, is massively used by the state. for all possible purposes, including, as we heard about that yesterday, for intelligence services, for military purposes, for other state purposes, and surely for the control of the people. This model is exactly the US AI model, so the US American model. Europe is exception from that. So it's all regulated by the European Commission and by the states, despite our differences between national legislation and plans of the European Commission. So no private companies could be compared with financial opportunities of the states and European Commission. That is the reality. No great companies like Google or Elon Musk or other great AI companies. Also, no comparison with Yandex. So they're only small and middle class companies. No monopolies in this sense, except governments, except states. I don't know, that means AI not totally controlled by the state. It's also created and regulated by the government. This model surely has not only good sides, so there are also problems with the model. That means how much should state control all that? It's not only crucial for government or police control or other form of the control. No, it's very crucial for development. For example, one of the most important points, unfortunately I didn't have time enough to present it, to support research and innovations with support of AI. Because the state try to control and to organize all initiatives. I'm not sure that is the most efficient way for development of the AI. But actually we'll see. It's just beginning. The most crucial problem, the problem of energy, the electricity. Europe doesn't have enough electricity and will not have it in the near future. And the controversy is huge. So from one point of view, European Commission speaks about green energy. And some countries like Germany closed nuclear power plants. And now it's clear that there's no electricity at all, not enough for the supercomputers, not enough for the AI, not enough for normal life. And the same German government speaks already about to build new nuclear power plants and to use coal for the purposes of AI. And import energy. For example, last year, the fourth powerful supercomputer was built in research center Jülich between Aachen and Cologne. So it's one of the most powerful supercomputers in the world. Where the energy comes from? not from Germany. It comes mostly from France and Belgium because these countries have enough electricity produced by the nuclear power plants. Germany doesn't have enough electricity for that, not for supercomputers. And the situation is crucial. So there's decision to build new power plants, but it comes only in 10 or 15, 12 years, if at all. The second point, independent of who build, who create, who control, in the majority of the cases, the software is created by NVIDIA, so the most important US American producer of software for AI everywhere. So Germany and European supercomputers, mostly NVIDIA. Russian supercomputer, also NVIDIA. Not speaking about them, I don't know what the situation in Brazil. I think it's very similar. So this company dominate. I don't know how it's in India, but I suppose it's very similar. So software for AI is monopolized by huge producers, and they're mostly US American. That is the reality. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail. It happens in online meetings. Things are easier, but sometimes we do run into technical issues. Now that Roger Crisp is back, we can pass the floor to him, and then we open to discussion again. Roger Crisp, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Carolina. My Zoom connection is unstable, but I'll keep going with my fingers crossed. I've enjoyed what I heard of the papers and the discussion so far. And I would like to begin by thanking Nita and his colleagues for the invitation to speak, and all of you for being here. I suppose I've been thinking seriously about AI governance for about a year. About a year ago, I had a conversation with somebody called Reid Hoffman. You may have heard of him. He founded LinkedIn. And he said to me he had no doubt that humanity had 2 generations left. And this rather stopped me in my tracks. And I thought there couldn't really be any other issue of more importance than AI ethics, and particularly AI ethical governance. So I'm going to say a bit about ethics before I get on to AI. As you probably know, the word ethics in English comes from the Greek word ethos, which means character. So ethics is about life. So your life is what contains your character, and it concerns everything in your life, but particularly actions rather than emotions. Though it does include emotions, we criticize people for their emotions or praise them as well. These, as Aristotle fully understood, are not voluntary. We can affect our emotions only by the actions that we perform. So when we're thinking about ethics, we're primarily thinking about actions. And myself, I think the person always to go back to is Aristotle. He was, of course, coming after Socrates and Plato in the Western tradition. But I think he was in a way, he was the first moral philosopher. If by that we mean somebody who does the kind of thing that we do. Socrates didn't really do what we do. He didn't try to come up with a theory and try to state it clearly, nor did Plato. Plato is more of a dramatist, obviously introducing some very interesting philosophical ideas. But Aristotle just sat down and thought, which is the correct ethical theory? And I think he actually got it largely right. So first of all, I would want to mention his doctrine of the mean, which he writes about in Book 2 of the Ethics, particularly 2.6, which many people have mocked as absurd. I think it's about right, actually. So first of all, I think he'd realised that if we're thinking about ethics, we need to think about domains of human lives, which we think are significant. So, for example, ownership and property matter to pretty well all of us, and there will be times in which we have to transfer some of that property to other people. And what Aristotle saw was that you've got to get it right when you transfer. You've got to transfer the right amount to the right people at the right time and so on. And he said the same about the emotions. So if you think about anger, for example, yes, there are times when you should get angry, but there are times when you shouldn't. And when you should get angry, you should get angry to a certain intensity and for a certain time. So I think the doctrine of the mean, the idea that what we're aiming at in living our lives is a kind of target, we're trying to get it right in every sphere, is correct. So what we're looking for here is a set of principles to govern our lives, and of course our actions in connection with AI governance. Now, those of you who are trained in ethics will have come across the idea that there are three theories in ethics: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. I think that's a mistake. I think, again, Aristotle got it right. There's just one theory which requires you to list the actions you think are right and the actions you think are wrong in the relevant spheres. So essentially, if we think about utilitarianism, any sensible person will accept the utilitarian principle as one principle among others. It's very sensible. Other things being equal, produce the greatest happiness that you can. So, for example, if you find yourself in a position where you have to buy a present for a child, and everything else is equal, but one of the toys in the shop will give them more happiness, then it would be irrational not to buy that toy if everything else is equal. So we all accept, on reflection, the utilitarian principle. The remarkable thing about utilitarianism is that it rejects every other principle. So many of us would say, well, you ought to tell the truth. Utilitarians don't say that. They say tell the truth only if it's what maximises utility. So really, utilitarianism is just common sense morality with every principle removed from it, apart from the utilitarian principle. Now, when it comes to virtue ethics, I mean, this is a view which has become very popular over the last 3 or 4 decades, and it seems to me just to rest on a simple mistake. Aristotle is often said to be a virtue ethicist, but he isn't. A virtue ethicist has to think that actions are made right by the fact that a virtuous person would do them. And of course that cannot be true, because virtuous people don't act for those reasons. If you're saving somebody from a pond, they're drowning in a pond, your reason for saving them is that they're drowning and they will die if you don't. It's not that you're a virtuous person. So the fact that you are a virtuous person never gives you a reason to do anything. So virtue ethics is really just best understood as either a mistake or it's a restatement of the Aristotelian position. So we're looking for the correct set of principles, and I think Aristotle will say the first thing we need to do is to be clear about what they are. It's then the case that you have to consider whether the principle you have is sufficiently abstract so that it would be true in all possible worlds. So ethics is philosophical ethics is aiming at stating the truths about ethics which apply everywhere and at all times. So in that sense, it's like mathematics. So most mathematicians will say to you, mathematical truths are necessary and a priori. Once you understand them, you can see that they're true in all possible worlds. And the same will be true of ethics. So the utilitarian is saying, in all possible worlds, what makes an action right, if there are any agents, is that it maximizes utility. Now, one thing I would say about utilitarianism, which is worth remembering, is that really no utilitarian has ever said, and no well-known utilitarian has ever said, that people should try to put the utilitarian principle into practice. I mean, William Godwin says things a bit like that sometimes, but it's pretty unusual, even for him. Utilitarians realise that there's great value in what we would call common sense morality. So the things that your parents taught you or your carers taught you, to tell the truth, to be kind and so on, the utilitarian is going to recommend that you follow all of those principles reflectively. There will be times when maybe you'll decide you shouldn't, but there'll be the exception. So I think that's one. If you're attracted to utilitarianism, that's one thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about AI governance. Think about which principles you think it would be helpful for people to follow when they're involved in AI governance. Also, Aristotle saw and so did Socrates and Plato as well, saw the importance of moral education. So, with many people working in AI at the moment, it's just too late for them to do the right thing because they're not really capable of it. They haven't been brought up properly, and you can tell that from the things that they do. And that's one of the reasons why AI is so dangerous, because many of the people with the power are very prone to vicious behaviour. And we also have to think about how to help people involved in AI governance themselves think ethically. And I will now come to that. So we've got to the stage where I have to state what I think is the correct ethical view. And of course, anybody has to do that. And myself, I think that the utilitarians are on the right track. I do think there's a lot to be said for the utilitarian principle, that we should create the greatest happiness in the world. But the problem with that principle is that it doesn't recognise what J.N. Findley and then Rawls called the separateness of persons. So we're all separate people, and if we create the happiest world, it could be that some of us do much worse than others. And that seems to me unacceptable. So I think something like a version of utilitarianism which is weighted towards assisting the worst off or the worse off is preferable. And I'm now going to go on to the details of AI governance, and I do think that many of the things I say here will sit well with utilitarianism or with common sense morality. Because one of the striking things about AI governance is that it's been done, as far as I can tell, in the absence of principled philosophical ethical reflection. Now, some of the most famous principles that many of you will know of were developed by UNESCO. I think what they were doing, I don't know this for a fact, but it looks to me as if what they might have been doing is taking the Google principles, which Google developed in 2018, and rewriting them, trying to make them a bit more precise. The UNESCO principles were agreed by 193 countries. One of the surprising things about them is that it's very hard to find out whether they've made any difference. Companies don't usually say anything about their own behaviour. I haven't come across much evidence that governments are checking that companies are following these principles, which is slightly worrying, and it would mean that obviously AI governance, the ethics of AI governance doesn't just consist in coming up with some principles. It includes ensuring that they're followed. But what I want to suggest is that the principles themselves are essentially good ones, sensible ones, and that's because they're in line with broadly the most plausible ethical theories. The one I mentioned, the weighted utilitarianism theory or common sense morality of the present day, which of course includes those utilitarian principles anyway. So the way UNESCO does it is they come up with values and principles. The values are respect, protection and promotion of human dignity, human rights and fundamental freedoms. That's the first set. Second is environment, the environment and ecosystem flourishing. Where that also seems sensible, but myself, I don't think it's valuable in itself. I think the environment is of value only for beings such as ourselves who have lives which can be good or bad for us. Of course, not many non-human animals come into that category as well, and actually, so perhaps some AIs will, or even do now. Third set of values is diversity and inclusiveness, and the fourth is living in harmony and peace. Again, they all seem to me plausible principles, plausible values, and we then get on to the principles, and I'll very quickly go through them. So the first principle is proportionality and do no harm. Well, that's really old-fashioned beneficence. Safety and security is the second principle. That's not a fundamental ethical principle. Be safe and secure. It's just instrumental, but obviously in the right cases it'll be a sensible approach to AI. I mean, if some evil actor is working on AI, we don't want them to be safe and secure. We want them to be unsafe and insecure so we can find out what they're doing. Third principle is fairness and non-discrimination. That seems to me a principle of broadly understood justice. Then the fourth principle is sustainability. I don't think that's a fundamental principle. That's another instrumental principle. Again, we wouldn't want the evil actor being sustainable. We want them to be acting in an unsustainable way. We want them to stop doing what they're doing. The fifth principle is privacy, which I think could plausibly be said to be required by beneficence broadly construed, and it's also instrumentally valuable in many cases. Sixth principle is human oversight and determination, which seems to me instrumental. It's not a fundamental principle. Translatability and explicability. That's principle 7. Again, I think that is a plausible principle, actually. I think on the whole it would promote beneficence and justice. It helped to avoid injustice if AI companies explain to us what they're doing. And the same goes for principle 8, which is a principle requiring responsibility and accountability. And awareness and literacy that's principle 9. Again, on the whole, I think probably instrumentally valuable, likely to promote the overall good. And the final principle is that we have multi-stakeholder and adaptive governance and collaboration. Strikes me as instrumental but perfectly sensible. And it is likely to result in increased justice through the sharing of the benefits of AI. So that's the list, and as I say, I think in general it seems to be in line with a plausible ethics, but it's a bit muddled in that final and non-final principles are being confused, and there's no rationale really for why they came up with that list in that order and not some other list. So I think it's a good start, but it hasn't gone far enough. It hasn't been properly enforced. It's not being closely monitored. So I hope that more work can be done on developing AI governance and overseeing it over the next few years, because it's certainly needed. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger, for your brilliant presentation. Now we will pass the word to the next presenter. You have 20 to 25 minutes for each talk. It is now my pleasure to introduce Chelsea Haramia from the Center of Science and Thought of the University of Bonn. She will present on sustainable technology and the extraterrestrial turn. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. May I share my screen and share some slides?
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful. Okay. Okay, thank you all so much for being in attendance, and thank you to the organizers of the conference today. I'm here to present on unsustainable technology and the extraterrestrial turn. So let's talk about unsustainable technology. In technology ethics, there have been a couple of calls for kind of increasing our understanding of how to place technology in the world. The first is that I'll refer to as the terrestrial turn from Lemons, Block, and Zweier in 2017, where they call on us to recognize the ecological impacts of technology, right? And so focusing on environmental sustainability, recognizing technology and its impacts as a planetary phenomenon, affecting the environment at the level of planetary systems. And this kind of recognition requires that we have a kind of a fundamental shift in our understanding of the key terms and concepts in technology ethics debates. A little bit later in 2024, Bolta and Van Weinsberg call for a structural turn. And this is a call to understand these kind of environmental and ecological impacts as also integrated into socio-technical structures, and then to recognize that technology ethics is not about discrete problems with piecemeal solutions, but in fact that these are kind of systemic and structural issues that the solutions for which need to apply at this grander scale, and when they don't, then we have a situation where we have techno solutions that uphold these structures and their concomitant injustices. And so both of these terms speak to environmental sustainability as well as social sustainability, and I think that they are excellent in terms of calling our attention to the kind of global and planetary and far-reaching aspects of technology ethics. But a criticism that I have of both of these calls is that they're very much earthbound. They're looking at technology here on planet Earth. However, human technology is not earthbound. So let's talk a little bit about unsustainable space. Now, the space sustainability paradox was coined by Wilson and Vasili in 2023, and it's a situation where the increased use of space to support sustainable development leads to heightened adverse impacts to both the space and Earth environment, right? And so the UN actually called access to space in line with all of its sustainable development goals, and called for greater equity in access to space. And one of the things we can do with access to space is use satellites, use human technology out in low Earth orbit to observe Earth. Earth observation satellites can help us to track and monitor environmental progress or environmental damage, and help to keep us on track towards environmental sustainability goals when we use it for those purposes. And so there are various other ways that we can use access to space and humans' technology in space, and specifically here in low Earth orbit, to help further sustainability goals and environmental goals. However, there's a kind of a simultaneous problem where access to space requires the very same kinds of, polluting and damaging practices that are very much part of why we have concerns about environmental and social sustainability in the first place. And so they call it a paradox, right? But it's just this problem, this puzzle. And so what I will talk about here are these parallel sustainability puzzles that show up across outer space ethics and technology ethics. And so with respect to AI and sustainable AI debates, we have Van Weinsberg in 21 calling for the distinction between AI for sustainability. And so this idea that you can use AI and AI tools and AI systems to help us solve really complicated sustainability problems. And at the same time, recognizing that the very same technology that we hope will help us to solve these sustainability problems is creating, maintaining, and exacerbating the very problems that it's supposed to be helping us solve. And so we have this kind of vicious circle, or this problem where, the solutions are themselves very much part of the problem, and we can't quite get out of this cycle that we're in. And so we see the same with space, and Wilson and Vasili call for a distinction regarding sustainability from space, and this idea that we can use access to space and, for example, Earth observation satellites and other such technologies to help us reach sustainability goals on Earth. But at the same time, sustainability of space, like these technologies, these practices, they're not neutral in terms of the sustainability impacts. And in fact, they often create, and exacerbate the very sustainability problems that they are supposed to help us solve. And so in addition to this, this idea that we have satellites, for example, and you can look at satellites across their entire life cycle, and collectively that's a source of pollution, just as Van Weinsberg talks about looking at AI and digital technologies across their entire life cycle and seeing those as their life cycle and seeing those as a collective source of pollution. We also have something called the Kessler effect, which is a paradigmatic sustainability issue. And so low Earth orbit is a finite space, and there's very little discussion about limits in terms of launching satellites and including satellite mega constellations into low Earth orbit. But there is a worry that increasing the amount of objects that we have orbiting our planet, every time we do that, it increases the probability that there is a collision. And if there is a collision in low Earth orbit, it will not be contained to the two colliding objects. It will create an exponentially cascading effect of kind of disaster that will cause all sorts of problems, both technologically, environmentally, raining destruction here on Earth. Beyond that, we have rocket launches and the carbon emissions that they create that contributes to global warming. They have created reusable rockets, but these are created using some pretty toxic materials and chemicals. And so we have the reuse portion, but they're still, creating environmental damage. Unsustainable orbits, I talked about atmospheric pollution on reentry burns. If we don't put satellites into graveyard orbits. We have them burn up on entry. This alters the makeup of our atmosphere in polluting ways. We end up with space litter on the land. We have the possibility of commercial use of space for mining that can be environmentally harmful. Worries about harm to outer space environments such as the moon or Mars, and the ecological effects of things such as light pollution from satellite megaconstellations. So there are all sorts of ways that access to space contributes to sustainability problems, including environmental ones, as just in the same kind of similar ways that using AI for sustainability also contributes to the very sustainability problems that we hope to solve. There's a unique element to the outer space puzzle, which is, human technology. These are artifacts. These are not environments themselves, but outer space is an environment in its own right. Outer space is full of natural phenomena. Here we have a picture of our neighbor Mars and some tracks from one of the rovers, looking back at the tracks it created. So here we have an environment. And so we have this extra element of a question of environmental sustainability. So why should we turn toward the extraterrestrial in light of these considerations and these puzzles? Well, partly because environmental ethics is not earthbound. We see this, and we see this space sustainability issues. Of course, technology ethics is not earthbound because human technology is not earthbound. And so to turn toward the extraterrestrial, contend that we need to think at the level of the planetary, as Lemons, Block, and Zweier, and Bolta and Van Weinsberg called on us to do, as well as the extraplanetary, which Wilson and Vasily call on us to do, and I contend at the level of the interplanetary, because I think that we do not need to think only about extraterrestrial technological impacts, but also about extraterrestrial technological sources. And so by this, I mean aliens. So the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is actually a search for extraterrestrial technology. Intelligence there is a proxy for technology, and what SETI practitioners are looking for is evidence of aliens' technologies. We have not detected any, and this leads to something called the Fermi paradox. And so with the Fermi paradox, we take the Drake equation, add it to the Great Silence, and end up with this question. Again, not a true paradox, as philosophers will happily point out, but more of a puzzling situation. And so with the Drake equation, N stands for the number of alien societies in the galaxy whose electromagnetic emissions are detectable. And then we have these other variables, such as the rate of star formation and the fraction of habitable planets, the ones that produce life, the ones that might produce technologically capable life. And then L is the kind of length of time that these societies, civilizations, species, extraterrestrial, others sustain themselves. And so according to what we know about the universe, it seems statistically quite likely that there are, not only lots and lots of potentially habitable exoplanets, but ones that, so many that it seems quite likely that at least some would produce life and produce technologically detectable life. Yet, after a few generations of searching for alien radio signals and other technosignatures, we haven't found any scientifically confirmable evidence of alien technology, which then leads to the question, where is everybody? Now, there are lots of potential and candidate solutions offered to Fermi's paradox, and I'm going to focus on just one for our purposes here today. This is the sustainability solution. And the sustainability solution to Fermi's paradox calls on the idea from Seth Baum and others, his co-authors, this idea that the absence of extraterrestrials could be explained by the fact that exponential growth is an unsustainable development. And so this leads to possibilities and speculations about a great filter. And sometimes this is called the great technological filter, right? This idea that even if lots and lots of species in the cosmos evolve to produce technology, there's this pretty big step, this filter where you have to get past it. And so you have to figure out how to not destroy yourself with your own technology. And then if you get past that, that's when you end up kind of having the kind of longevity that allows for your detectability. Now, this great filter is an example of what SETI founder, astronomer Jill Tarter, calls a cosmic mirror. And so when you have SETI science and you think about the project of searching for alien others, so much of the speculation ends up just reflecting back down onto us, onto humans and our planet and our practices. And so why would we worry about a great technological filter? It's very obvious that we worry because we are facing that kind of issue here and now, right? And so this are Anthropocene concerns, and we recognize that we are in a position with our technology and our capabilities to destroy ourselves by engaging in the kinds of technological practices we have come to adopt at a planetary level. And so there have been lots of like epochs before, right? So an epoch is a planetary kind of era, or sorry, phenomenon where the geologic record and the atmospheric record like shifts, and you can see the record of that, and we can study that. And so there have been plenty of shifts in our planet's history at the epoch level before, but they've all been naturally occurring and the result of natural phenomena. The Anthropocene is a human-caused event, right? So never before has a planetary level force been aware of its own influence. And this is in the spirit of David Grinspoon, who wrote, "Is it possible that our growing awareness of our role on Earth can itself play a pivotal role in shaping the outcome?" So he's a planetary scientist, and he talks a lot about this idea of the Anthropocene epoch, and wants to contrast it with the possibility of what he calls a Sapizoic eon. And so he recognizes that global technological influence clearly contains both peril and promise. There's lots of potential with humans' technology and its continuing extension and ability to affect planetary systems. But there's also a lot of peril. And so the peril is what we're facing right now, the Anthropocene epoch. It's unsustainable, it's short-lived, and in fact, we may destroy ourselves so quickly that we don't even qualify as an epoch-level event, that we only live a very, very short mark on the geologic and atmospheric records. But this possibility for promise, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. He has a whole book on it, but he calls it the Sapizoic Eon, and so it's not guided by kind of technological prowess or power or capability, but guided by wisdom. And so it's this aspirational, deeply sustainable age of wisdom. And as a philosopher and an ethicist, he doesn't mention moral wisdom, but this seems to me to be a potentially very relevant factor in pursuing a sustainable and a wise trajectory as a species. And so we will return to moral wisdom in a moment, but let's continue with this search for unsustainable technology. So again, SETI practitioners are searching for evidence of extraterrestrial technology. We're looking for what we know. And what we know is what humans are capable of. And so we end up looking for a lot of things that, even if that's not what humans are currently doing, it's the kinds of things that we imagine humanity as being motivated by. And so the Kardashev scale, it comes up a lot in SETI discussions. And the Kardashev scale it's an idea. It's a prospect for how alien societies, or as Kardashev calls them, civilizations, kind of develop on a specific kind of trajectory. And so a type 1 civilization has the ability to harness and use the energy of its entire planet. A type 2 society has the ability to harness and use the power of the energy of its parent star. And a type 3 society has the ability to harness and use the power and energy of its entire galaxy. And so we have no evidence, no extraterrestrial evidence that this is in fact how any alien species is on track toward in terms of their technological evolution. And in fact, we don't have evidence even of a type 1 society, species, or civilization. Not even humans aren't even at the type 1 level. But this comes up a lot because this idea of just kind of unchecked growth is ingrained in so much of discourse, dominant discourse about human technology and technology debates. So the SETI searches originally started with the search for electromagnetic radio signals, because we realized that our radio signals were detectable at interstellar distances, and just realized, we might be able to detect others. The search has since expanded to include many more possible what we call technosignatures, again, evidence of detectable alien technology. And so right now, SETI scientists look not only for radio signals, but also for waste heat or chlorofluorocarbons in exoplanet atmospheres. I was at a talk a couple weeks ago where there was a scientist describing how we might detect microplastics in an exoplanet's atmosphere. They search for Dyson spheres. Dyson spheres are a theoretical construct that would help you to achieve that type 2 status and harness the power of your parent star. And what you might end up noticing is that what we're looking for is some combination of pollution, right, of environmental degradation, and an unchecked growth kind of consumption expansionist mindset. And so there are folks such as LeBoyron who call pollution kind of inherently colonial. And Hilding Nelson from a talk just a short while ago had this slide where technosignature, he calls technosignatures pollution and pollution colonialism. And so the point here is that we are looking for extraterrestrial technology, but what we're actually looking for is unsustainable extraterrestrial technology. We're not looking to detect sustainable technology because we don't know what detectable sustainable technology looks like. Again, we're looking for ourselves. And so there's this sense and this sentiment that, you know, this unchecked growth mindset, this constant expansion is somehow some sort of universal or universalizable like attitude that we can expect to find out in the cosmos. However, not only do we not have evidence of it out in the cosmos, here on Earth, it is an attitude that is very much in the minority if you look at the anthropological record. And so here's a quote from Willie Lempert, an Indigenous scholar and social scientist, who says, when considering the totality of human societies, past and present, the desire to expand endlessly is actually incredibly rare. And so this unchecked growth mindset is the exception and not the rule. And across human societies and human cultures, there have been many, many more kind of sustainability-minded practices rather than the unchecked growth practices. However, that is what is common in dominant ideas about humanity and in dominant discourse. And so this focus on increasing technological consumption and expansion, it is one way of being. It is not the only way of being, right? It's an idea. It's a choice or a series of choices. And it's also the kind of thing that lots of humans think is unwise, right? Lots of humans right now think it's unwise. Lots of humans throughout history, we have evidence that they thought it was unwise, at least insofar as they pursued other more sustainable practices. And so let's think about how to be wise. And so if we think about moral wisdom, if we return to this idea that we could perhaps consider guiding our species trajectory, our technological trajectory, according to wisdom, then we end up with, you know, some cool scholarship that's been done on this possibility for moral wisdom and flourishing. So, of course, in the Western tradition, we have Aristotle and the Nicomachean ethics and this virtue ethics tradition, where the goal is not something like mere sustainability. It's in fact like active flourishing, and thinking about how to be the best kind of version of yourself as an individual. Now, we're thinking, however, at the level of the human species. And you can see these ideas about more community or collective level flourishing in a lot of non-Western traditions that are also thinking along the lines of these like traditional Western virtue ethicists, but also considering the collective or community level that includes not only humans, but community members that may be parts of the environment, certainly parts of the ecosystem, but also non-living parts of the environment, such as geologic formations, mountains, stars, etc. And so if we look to these traditions, we can discover guidance for figuring out how to get on the right trajectory as a species so that we not only fail to kill ourselves with our own technology, and we not only achieve sustainability goals, but also pursue actively flourishing at the species level. So what is the extraterrestrial turn? There's a lot more to it, but I don't have time for all of it today. But it's not a quick fix, right? It demands a collective shift in dominant attitudes toward humanity, toward technology, and its trajectory and effects on our planet, our solar system, and our universe. This shift would, of course, take time and honest reflection. It would require considerations of humanity as a collective, including past, present, and future humans. So this collective persists across time, even as humans come into and out of existence. And these are humans who are rooted in our planet, rooted in planet Earth, yet capable of relating well to both the planetary and the extraplanetary. It's interspecies. It's technologically hybrid. It's importantly not a techno solution, though there is a role for technology as we know it, and especially for technology as we don't know it, namely sustainable digital technologies. The goal is not technological development, but ethical development. So it's focused not on planetary human power, nor on extraplanetary human power, but on planetary and extraplanetary human wisdom. And so, of course, it's deeply aspirational. Becoming wise as a species, it is not a foregone conclusion, but neither is irresponsible expansion or our own self-destruction. So we have good reason to aim at becoming a species with the right attitudes toward our unique powers, our shared futures, and our hopes for discoveries about ourselves and our place in the universe. There are some references, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Chelsea. Now I invite the audience to share questions. You may write them in the chat or raise your hand. Please feel free to ask your questions, addressing both Roger's and Chelsea's presentations. We will start with Max, who already had his hand raised, then Professor Nitamar. Then we follow the discussion.
Thanks very much, Carolina. It's very nice of you to notice that it was very brief with my hand. Thank you to both of you for the excellent presentations. Maybe I start with Roger. Roger, good to see you. I was very interested in how you describe the different approaches to ethics, virtue ethics, Aristotle, consequentialism. I want to follow up on a discussion that Nitamar and I had, and that is whether certain ways of approaching ethics will be more amenable to how AI works. So AI has a certain modus operandi. The computer scientists, they're keen to pursue a form of instrumental rationality, think of everything as an optimization problem, think that the different values and objectives are commensurable. So it looks like a consequentialist approach to ethics is something that would work very well with the computer science methods that underlie AI. So I wonder what you think, whether the governance of AI should be closer to how the AI systems work technically, or do you think it would be better to maybe go for something like Aristotelian phronesis that can't be quantified or commensurized in an easy way, but still maybe would be a good contrast there?
Thanks, Max. An excellent question. One which would require a couple of hours to answer, but I'll try in half a minute. Yeah, I think you've got a very good point there. I'm not sure, it doesn't count in favour of any kind of consequentialism, that it's easier to operationalize in AI. So it would be a sort of lucky benefit, I suppose. And it is true that, as it were, the more complex one makes one's ethics, the less useful it would be in this context. But if one thinks that is the right form of ethics, then one, of course, has to do one's to do one's best with it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, once again, thank you very much, Professor Roger Chris, Professor Chelsea Haramia, for these thought-provoking presentations. I have a very single, well, actually, it's going to be a couple of questions, but I'll make just one question for each one of you, if you allow me to do so. Roger, I really enjoyed your presentation very much, along what Max just mentioned of this whole thing of combining utilitarian models and in interlocution with Aristotelian virtue ethics. And I was curious to know, how would you respond to this very urgent problem we are facing today in terms of national security? Because you mentioned in your list of principles the idea of safety or security. And of course, if you think in terms of cyber safety, cyber security, we can understand it's more like a technological problem that could be dealt with in both private and public spheres. But we all know very well that the military are the ones who really call the shots when it comes to decision-making process in terms of a national security. So I was wondering, how would you respond? It could be in Aristotelian terms or in utilitarian terms, to this very problem of world threat because of lack of international regulation for the use of AI or these new technologies, especially when we see, geopolitical interests like in the current wars going on in the planet. And for Chelsea, I really enjoyed your presentation, Chelsea, and I was wondering also, relating to this problem of geopolitics, we all know that the space race dating back to the Cold War period was very much related to to missiles and to the whole thing of hegemony right after Second World War. And of course, the idea is very interesting to pursue in terms of a broader understanding of sustainability. But how do you respond to this whole problem of getting to some kind of a sustainable approach to AI and new technologies when people like Savulescu and others have realized that the two problems seem to be going together. The geopolitical problems that we can't come to some world agreement in terms of getting to solve our own problems on Earth. And as we go elsewhere, like extraterrestrial approaches to sustainability, we're still facing the problem on Earth, meaning that, for instance, people who resorted to low tax or so-called primitive approaches to technology, they seem to be much more sustainable than the way most human beings are, resorting to new technologies and making human life itself very improbable on our own planet because of geopolitical interests. So I'd like to see how would you respond to that. Thank you very much, guys.
Roger, you want to go first?
Thanks very much, Nita. So ethics, we have to remember, is about what we should do. And the situation we're in at the moment, as far as I can see, is that there is a race to develop the most effective AI weapons between the United States and China. This is going on the whole time. It's dominating world politics. It's absolutely terrible. Whichever side wins, it's going to be very worrying. Ethics is about what we should do, and the Chinese and the Americans should stop being silly, get together, realize the situation we're in, and collectively find a way out.
Thanks. Yes, as an American, I agree. So one of the things that I think was in my talk that can help to address this is pushing back against the idea that certain things are just human nature or foregone conclusions or inevitable, right? And so that was part of this idea of when we're looking for technosignatures as pollution, we're looking for unsustainable technology because we're in this grip of like understanding dominant technologies as this kind of inevitable trajectory of technology, when of course it doesn't have to be, right? And this idea of these like kind of dominant attitudes toward kind of unchecked expansion, growth, consumption, and these kind of similar dominant attitudes that Roger Chris was just talking about, like competition and what counts as success, and like dominance in terms of like military dominance and things like that. So all of these things are not kind of uniform values across human cultures, right? And these are kind of many of them, at least with respect to these dominant technologies, are much more recent phenomenon. This idea of unchecked growth and consumption and expansion. These are like idiosyncratic. Again, they're the exception and not the rule across human histories. And so if we get this idea, like kind of really agitate the assumptions that people have about what humans are like, or what our trajectory what trajectory we're going to be taking, and get other ideas into the mix, I think that's really important. And so that's part of why I pointed out wanting to have non-Western scholarship on things such as like flourishing and virtue. And there are traditions that have done a lot of interesting work on this. So Ubuntu ethics in Africa, post-war social theory in Japan. There are indigenous ethicists in New Zealand, and these Maori and Native Americans in the United States. There are all sorts of different, unique approaches that are very much kind of counter to what dominant attitudes are when it comes to thinking about how we flourish, how we live well, how we survive and thrive as a community, as a collective. But I would say, in addition to talking to and platforming indigenous and non-Western voices, I think also looking at like the history you talked about, like the Cold War history, and looking actually to the science, right? And here I even mean to like dominant Western science. And so there's a really nice book out by Rebecca Charbonneau called Mixed Signals, Extraterrestrial Communication Across the Iron Curtain, and it's about the history of SETI. And it turns out the SETI scientists in the US and Russia were actually working together quite a bit, as much as they could. And you saw collaboration, even in this really hostile kind of international and political setting. You saw just really like sincere concern from scientists on both sides when they realized that their science was being used to further military ends that they didn't necessarily agree with. And then you think about like the dual use and the fact that so much of what goes on isn't just, again, a discrete issue with its kind of discrete boundaries of effects. But in fact, there was even some reason to think that, the Hubble telescope that gave us some of the first perspectival indications of just how vast the universe is and just how many galaxies there are, that was originally a spy satellite, spy technology that was meant to look down here on Earth, and they just sort of realized, oh, we could point it out to the cosmos too. And so, what are our values, right? If we're discovering stuff about the cosmos because we're kind of interested in exploiting and spying on and dominating humans here on Earth, that seems kind of backwards, right? And so getting on a better trajectory, again, not a foregone conclusion, not a guarantee. The dominant attitudes that are so destructive and so frankly stupid, right? These like just these very unsustainable cycles. They're also very kind of put on by very powerful people, and so it's a real challenge, right? And so the how is not the ethical question, as Roger pointed out. The why should, what justifies the odds. That's what we can do, right? And so I know I've been talking a lot, but one quick thing, because I get this a lot. I do a lot of interdisciplinary presentations where they say, okay, that's all well and good. I agree that that's what we should be doing, but how do we get these big power players on board? And part of my answer is that one thing we don't do is to say it's a foregone conclusion that they're going to act unethically, and so the rest of us have to scramble to figure out what to do in light of that, because that gets them off the hook, and that is an enabling kind of attitude. And so one of the things we can do is to keep explaining exactly why that behavior is in fact wrong, and putting responsibility, in addition to on ourselves, on the power players, and really holding them to account whenever it's possible.
Thank you, colleagues. We had another hand raised. James, feel free to ask your question, and then we move on to our final presentation.
Yeah, it's just a quick question for Chelsea. Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion and the presentation, and I get the point of like bringing different like perspectives, from different human cultures. But do you think that with that, should we like interrogate the emergence of this type of second nature, of this endless pursuit of efficiency, of progress for the sake of it? So is trying to pinpoint, tell, well, let's show how this emerges, how this becomes like the discourse, the dominating discourse, and maybe also interrogate how we interact, what these technologies afford for us to interact, and how this keeps us reproducing this mode of living.
Yes.
Also.
Sorry. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. We need to not only kind of platform like really viable and valuable and like flourishing focused alternatives, but also, yes, critique what's going on here and now, because it's so hard. It's hard to do anything that doesn't contribute to this like kind of unsustainability cycle, right? And so when we were talking about technosignatures, I said we're looking for unsustainable detectable technology, right? Because that's what, like, our technology that's detectable is all of this dominant and often digital technology, right? But there's all kinds of human technologies that aren't, kind of that haven't been unsustainable. And so I have a colleague who writes about bread as a technosignature, right? And bread is evidence of humans' technology. But she's looking at the history of bread. If we look at bread right now, especially in like the Western world, in North America, especially North America and the US, like bread doesn't, like, it is absolutely feeding into these unsustainability cycles. The production, the way it produces waste, the monocultures that go into the wheat, all of it is very much about producing profit, right? And when if we look to these other traditions that were much more sustainable, even though they're making bread too, the value, what was being valued was like kind of ecological sustainability, biodiversity, things like that. That was viewed as primitive, right? And we're advanced when we're making like really like culinary atrocities. And so like, yeah, not just critiquing, but like really flipping, right? This understanding of what counts as progress, what counts as value, and what counts as advanced, right?
Thank you guys for this engaging discussion. Let's move to the final presentation of this session. I invite Zhao Fan from Vrije University, Brussels. I apologize if I didn't pronounce it correctly. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just share my slides. Okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the introduction, and I also want to thank Professor Netma for always including me. Although I'm not really working on ethics or moral philosophy. And also I actually have some code, so I hope that my voice or noise will not be very annoying later. So today I want to talk about something that I'm kind of interested in, but also puzzled about, which is the so-called moral Turing test. So I gave a talk about the so-called moral Turing test 2 years ago in the previous edition of this conference. And also I see recently there are also some interest about this topic, and there's some publications out. But of course, I mean, compared to the Turing test literature, this is just a very small, tiny quantities. So I think people must think that there's something wrong, I mean, or problematic with the moral Turing test. So I'm curious about why this is the case and what's wrong about it. So there are basically three agendas. So in the first part, I'm going to briefly overview the Turing test and the moral Turing test. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of objections in the literature to the moral Turing test. And then I'm going to finally talk about, because those objections are somehow based on, in my view, a misconception of the moral Turing test as well as the Turing test. So a natural tendency is that we have to assimilate the moral Turing test with the actual or original Turing test. But then I think there are some problems or challenges. Okay, so the Turing test, of course, was initially proposed by Alan Turing in 1950. And he had some earlier versions in 1948, but we will just focus on the 1950 paper. So he began with a very simple question: can machines think? And Turing thinks that this question is somehow problematic in the sense that people would really have disagreements about what is thinking, or maybe even what is a machine. So instead of keep arguing about the definition in this question, Turing suggested that he used the term imitation game. And he actually gave two imitation games. So the first game is the man-woman imitation game. So you have three players. A is the man, B is the woman, and C is the judge. So the man's role is to imitate a woman. And of course, you can imagine that those three players are in separate rooms, and they may communicate through a chat box. So the judge's role is to decide after a reasonable amount of verbal conversation, a textual conversation, which is the man and which is the woman. And after this man-woman imitation game, Turing proposed the machine-human imitation game. So again, we have three players. So A is a machine, B is a human, and C is a judge. And other things being equal, now the machine's role is to imitate a human, and the judge is to decide which is a machine and which is a human. So after describing these two imitation games, so Turing points out his own question. So he says, we now ask the question, what will happen when the machine takes a part of A in this game? Will the interrogator decide wrongly as often when the game is played like this as he does when the game is played between a man and a woman? These questions replace our original, can machines think? So the original Turing test, taking strictly from what he wrote, actually consists of two imitation games, and there are three players in each game. So inspired by the Turing test, in 2000, Alan, Werner, and Zinser, so they published a paper, proposed the idea of the moral Turing test. And again, they want to answer the questions, can machines be moral agents? But of course, we have a similar problem about what is really morality, maybe even what is agent or what is a machine. So then they proposed that quote, a moral Turing test might similarly be proposed to bypass disagreements about ethical standards by restricting the standard Turing test to conversations about morality. If human interrogators cannot identify the machine at above chance accuracy, then the machine is, on this criteria, a moral agent. So, and of course, you might immediately notice that they actually have a simplified Turing test in mind. So there's only like one imitation game, and there could be two or three players. So I will return to the difference of this at the third part of my talk. But for now, let's just take the simplified Turing test and also the simplified moral Turing test in mind. Okay, so and there are actually a couple of objections. Some are being raised over and over again. And So first objection is that some moral agents would fail the moral Turing test. So Alan, Werner, and Zisser themselves even raised this question. So they said, so many people think that young children or even dogs are moral agents, even though they are incapable of articulating the reasons for their actions. So if you put the young children or even a dog into the moral Turing test, and presumably they couldn't pass the test. And so then they propose an alternative moral Turing test, although in a way I think may actually cannot really fulfill their purpose. But here's what they said. So an alternative moral Turing test could be structured in such a way that the interrogator is given pairs of descriptions of actual morally significant actions of a human and artificial moral agent, purged of all references that would identify the agents. If the interrogator correctly identifies the machine at a level above chance, then the machine has failed the test. So one thing to point out is that it looks like, I mean, even you put the young children or even dogs into this alternative moral Turing test, so they will presumably fail, I mean, the test. But that's not the main issue that I want to talk about. But basically this objection is that some moral agents are not good at it or incapable of articulating their reasons. So the moral Turing test cannot include those agents. As a counterpart, in 2016, Arnold and Schultz, they wrote a paper against the moral Turing test, and they propose the idea that there could be some moral agents that are super good at articulating moral reasons. So this is similar, like in the original Turing test, there could be super intelligence that are really good at something that our human beings are incapable of doing or have difficulties in doing. So they said if a responding machine could be more moral than human beings in a certain context, it indicates from the start the parameters of a moral Turing test, what moral attribution would be earned by a system that failed to present an action it took to be the best. Why would passing the test take moral priority over actually arriving upon the ultimate moral response to a challenge? So I take them to actually express two worries. So the first worry is that so the super moral agent would fail the test. And the second worry is that, well, if the super intelligent moral agent wants to pass the test, then this agent must hide what it took to be the best. And if that is the case, then what kind of moral attribution can we say to the answers that this agent gave? But in my view, and actually this has been actually pointed out, I mean, in the literature of the Turing test, that failing the test doesn't really means anything. So in other words, so the moral Turing test and also the Turing test is not necessary for moral or intelligence attribution. So of course, like I referred to Proudfoot, but she also I think emphasized this point in many papers before about the Turing test. Okay, so but then there's a second, which I think is a better objection by Aaron and Schultz, which is saying that the moral Turing test, in the moral Turing test, there's always a gap between reason giving and action. So they said still the ultimate and fundamental test for a moral attribution, after all, lies not in hypothetical judgment or imagined action. It lies in the relevant action itself, reflected upon, decided upon, and performed in real circumstances. While a system may be able to arrive at good reasons for this or that action when presented with a narrative that is consistent with moral hypocrisy and cowardice, where one does not act according to one's stated reasons and values, due perhaps to weakness, delusion, or cynicism. So the idea, I think, is pretty simple and also makes sense, which is that so if you ask in the moral turn test, ask the machine a lot of questions, or even ask what kind of action you may take, and the machine might be able to give you some really sensible and good reasons or actions that it would take. But if in the real world situation, if we put the machine in the real world situation, the machine might do something different without good or sensible reasons. So in that sense, even for a machine that passes the test, doesn't mean that it is a moral agent, because there's always the possibility that it perform differently. And in my view, I think this is somehow too strong, or put a too strong requirement for the moral Turing test, because if the moral Turing test is a ultimate and fundamental test for a moral attribution, then I agree that this objection destroys the test. But personally, I think the moral Turing test and the Turing test just offers a prima facie and also fallible reason for moral or intelligence attribution. So it's a starting point, but not the ending point. And I think this is consistent with our experience. So for example, like of course, you think, presumably you don't really have the question of whether or not I can speak English, right? But there's always a possibility that I'm now actually playing some pre-recording thing that other people are speaking this, and I don't really speak English, right? So there's always a possibility. But if this is the Turing test for English speaking, then I think at least my performance gives you some prima facie and also fallible reason for English speaking attribution. And I think similarly bar should be set for the moral Turing test as well. Okay, so finally, I want to just briefly talk about there's some difficulties, because so when I talk about, in my response to the two objections, I mentioned that there are actually some misunderstanding or conception of the Turing test. So, but what if now we really try to assimilate the original version in Turing's paper with the moral Turing test? So what kind of problem do we have? And I think the biggest problem is that, so the original Turing test consists of 2 imitation games, but there's little sense, at least for me, there's little sense for the moral Turing test to consist of 2 imitation games, because it doesn't make sense to have a man to imitate a woman and then they talk about moral issues, and then let the judge to decide which is a man and which is a woman. But if we grant this, then there are actually 2 advantages and similarly to disadvantages of the moral Turing test. And empirically, the advantages is that it is actually easier to have a criteria of when the machine passes the test. So in Turing's original version, so we can have the man's performance as a parameter. But in a simplified version, so we can only give some kind of number, let's say 50% or 60%, without good justification. But more importantly, so philosophically speaking, so the original Turing test is really not a test about the machine, right? So in Turing's paper, which I quoted, that he asked whether the judge would decide wrong as often as the judge did in the man to woman imitation game. So really, what is being tested is the judge. But in the moral Turing test, because we don't have this kind of two versions, so it looks like what is the subject of being tested is the machine. And if that is the case, it is really difficult to avoid behaviorism's interpretation of the test. Whereas in Turing's original version, it can avoid behaviorism's interpretation, because if it is a behaviorism's interpretation, then you don't have to have this parameter. You can just observe what the machine behaves. So that's why, so in conclusion, that I think, the moral Turing test, I think, is an interesting idea. And we know that the Turing test has been performed like empirically by different people, different artificial intelligence, but I'm not sure about the situation of the moral Turing test. But it could be something interesting to explore, both as empirical criteria and as a philosophical tools to reflect what we mean by morality or artificial morality. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Zal, for your brilliant presentation. Just a quick note, as Guilherme mentioned, this session is being recorded and will be uploaded later to our YouTube channel. We are not currently live on YouTube, but the Zoom link is public and available on the event page. And if you would like to access to the recording afterwards, you can email Guilherme. His email is in the chat, and he will share the link with you. So let's open the floor for our discussion. Again, feel free to share your questions in the chat or raise your hand here in the dashboard. Professor Nitamari, you raised your hand.
Yes. Thank you, Zhao, for your extremely interesting presentation. Of course, there would be many components to this whole problem of trying to formalize, in terms of the Turing test, what would be a normative or specifically moral approach to the Turing test. And I understand that part of this has been dealt with by Diane Proudfoot in her paper, Turing's test versus the moral Turing test, which was, as far as understood, was a big part of your inspiration for your own research. So I was wondering, how would you respond to a problem that you also mentioned in Alan Varner and Zinzer's influential version about this? Because especially in terms of the empirical components, when we talk about moral behavior, of course, this could be a very complex problem, even for moral philosophers, without thinking of the Turing test. But I would like to see if you could offer some of your own critical reflections about this. For instance, the fact that you have so many different contexts, cultural context of a moral action. How do you think that in terms of artificial intelligence, new technologies, or especially in terms of a Turing test, formal way of, or let's say technical approaches to the formal presentation of the moral Turing test, how do you think you can deal with these cultural, contextual components, which would be the empirical level that, as you mentioned, was already part of many of these discussions from the very beginning? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. And yeah, so of course, I mean, in terms of the empirical level, this is going to be very difficult. But this is also, I mean, true for the Turing test because it's basically a, open-ended, there's no restrictions about what you can talk. In some sense, that sounds like very, because then you feel like, oh, it's difficult to, begin with. But, the moral Turing test sounds like very narrow, but it gives you some, concrete starting point at least. So I'm not really, I mean, I don't really, I mean, have any, I mean, thoughts about like empirically on the empirical level what it how it performed. But I think one possibility is maybe to have a look at, I mean, how people are actually, I mean, those practitioners are actually doing the Turing test. So their strengths and weakness of performing this empirical test might give some idea about how one should perform the moral Turing test if one wants to do that.
Thank you, Zhao. We have another raised hand, Felipe Lacour. Feel free to share your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I hesitated in formulating various questions to each of the panelists, but I think I'll just make one question and ask for maybe a global contribution. Referring a bit selfishly to my own presentation of yesterday, which has, I think, a bit to do with what Chelsea meant. I showed by sort of proving by the existence of another technological option, I sort of proved the necessity to integrate in any kind of tech reflection about AI, what I would call an opting out option. That is the very right to say no, because sometimes it's not the proper technology that we need. So I sort of relate to what you were saying without going in outer space, so to speak. So I'd like to know, I sort of understand it has to do with your Fermi's paradox, but I'm not so confident. So let me state it as a general option. The problem that I'm facing when we come to environment issues, and then that you sort of make a plea for this opting out option, is of course you seem a bit medieval to the other people. Okay, you sort of sound technophobic and backwards looking. So the idea is, how do you neutralize the implicit argument behind this objection of being sort of regressive? How do you neutralize the argument that the very tech solutions are going to neutralize the normative and ethical and political issues that are produced by the development of AI? Okay, and we have now an environmental problem with AI or technology in general, but future technology will already solve this problem. So the projection into the future neutralizes the normative issue that we have. And there's a kind of circle here that makes any kind of normative reflection and opting out option impossible. Okay, so this is why we have to move on and accept any kind of new technology just because it's new and it's progress. I'd like to know how you guys cope with this, with your different ethical options. I'm not sure I was clear enough, but Thank you.
So I'll go ahead, but also very happy to hear from the other speakers. So yeah, I think, a couple of avenues of response. One, that idea of like being medieval or a Luddite or just like kind of backwards or primitive and not interested in like advanced, right? Then going back to like my call earlier to that many have made to really to critique what counts as advance, what counts as progress, right? But you're right that when we have these tech lords and these systems that are imposed on us, like it's so coercive, right? It's not even that we don't get to opt out. Is that even when you do, they make the alternative so much worse than it was before they had introduced the AI or whatever, that it's just coerces you into doing this thing because they ensure that you don't have good options. And so then you can look to, work in feminist philosophy about, you know, people not just having a right to certain kinds of treatment, but having the right to real options, real choices in their life. And so that can be one way of approaching this. And then another way that I think I was thinking of that now is just slipping my mind. So maybe I'll give the other speakers a chance to chime in, and I'll think of what I was going to say. Okay, I remembered. So another thing is grassroots AI systems. So talking to some colleagues who do work in Africa, so their goal isn't to reject technology per se, or even digital technology or AI. What they want to do is kind of reclaim or claim like an authority and ownership over what that AI is, how it's used for. And so, you know, not it doesn't all have to be like these enormous Silicon Valley kind of LLM chatbot style massive and coercive systems, right? There are alternative AI systems. And so things that can promote communities and, grassroots areas where they can really use AI at the local level. There, you're not rejecting technology, you're just rejecting dominant attitudes toward technology and rejecting the reliance on like the Silicon Valley style tech lord versions of these AI systems and reimagining what they can really be used for.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. We still have some time for discussion. If anyone would like to share your thoughts or questions, please feel free to do so. Once again, I warmly encourage you to share your questions and reflections. We have had a series of outstanding presentations, and I'm sure that any contributions will greatly enrich our discussion.
So, Philip, I missed your talk, and I'm wondering if it's anything that's published anywhere that I could see, because it sounds very relevant.
Sort of. It's been recorded, so I think you'll have
Okay.
access to it, but we can be in touch later. Thank you very much. I'm gonna take a
Great.
look at your own work myself.
Thanks.
I could bring something to staying within this conversation of like trying to change the mode that we are living by bringing different modes that could challenge, or are they challenging? Because there's and I'm thinking about like social theory in a way, so praxeological social theory, in a way that if one thinks of like a form of life that we live, we have to think of these modes as these critical modes as something aspiring to change or to be something that everybody had like a strong claim, like a strong ethical claim, because we had like modes of living that challenge the establishment, or the ones like hippie culture, or like there's a lot of like communities in Europe that close themselves and live with different modes of production. But how can we avoid this this not changing the form of our lives and falling into like, oh, this is a different lifestyle that kind of like becomes something that lives parallel and sometimes reinforces the establishment that said, well, this is how it works, and these are the different types of like strains of different things that don't really challenge the overarching mode of living within technology. Of course, it's not this abstract that works in the exact same way everywhere, but it shares some tenets. Well, capitalism is not the same in Brazil, that is the same in Germany, but it has some tenets that is shared, especially right now. So I don't know, just thinking.
So, if you don't mind, I'll try to answer again. And what I presented on, there's again more to it, and it's going to be coming out in a chapter we're editing here from Unibon on sustainable AI futures. And one suggestion for this kind of how question draws on virtue ethics, and I will say I'm not a virtue ethicist. I'm at best a pluralist, but but like I do think that this virtue ethical idea of kind of primary is a question of how to be and how to live well before you can think about like kind of what to do and what you should do. And so thinking of their moral exemplars, right? And so imagining what a moral exemplar would do, and then using that to guide your understanding of how to be in the world, right? And so with the extraterrestrial term, I call for imagining alien exemplars, right? So imagining like what kind of alien species would we want to meet, right? What would they act like? What would they be like? Um, and like can we imagine like a truly virtuous alien species in a really grand kind of species level collective sense? And then even if they don't exist, right, that kind of methodological tool is there to help us kind of like think critically about how we want to be. And so this is like, if you're familiar with the torment nexus, right? The old tweet, like the sci-fi author says, I created the story of the torment nexus as a cautionary tale, and then the evil Techler or whoever is like, we finally created the torment nexus. So it's like that, but inverse, right? So instead of like thinking about the worst possible things as cautionary tales, thinking of the best possible ways to be as aspirational tales. Again, this is just very thank you. Not need to ET phone home. This is very you know kind of practical in a way, and it's certainly not something I have any social science to point to as like something that's been tried, but it is kind of bringing in this Aristotelian idea of living well, but applying it at the species level instead of the individual level.
Well, if we have no more comments or questions, let's move to our lunch break. It was a pleasure to moderate this panel. Thank you all for your participation, and especially to our speakers for their valuable contributions. So we will now take a break for lunch, and I invite everyone to resume the sessions at 2 p.m. And Guilherme wrote here that we are going to offer a coffee break afterwards. So that's it. Have a great rest of the conference. We see you at 2 p.m. here.
I'm sorry, isn't there a session beginning now that's on the program?
No, at 2 p.m. Brazilian time.
Only at 2 p.m.
Right.
There was another one from now on until noon. Okay.
That's
Thank
it.
you.
See you guys.
Thank you.
See you
Bye.
soon. See you soon, guys.
See you
Thank you.
soon.
Bye.
Thank you very much.